Zombies. The word itself is all it takes to plant a visual in your mind of the monster. A corpse reanimated by a plague or by a curse with the sole intention of hunting you down, feasting on your flesh, and turning your lifeless corpse into a husk like itself. They feel no pain, fear, or remorse. They only feel a carnal hunger for the living. Alone, they aren't much of a threat, but in hordes of hundreds upon thousands, they become a sea of damnation and hopelessness. The apocalypse could have no more certain visual than this. A river of the dead seeking to feed on the living. We've seen these monsters sensationalized in our movies, TV shows, video games, anime, and cartoons. Their abilities, traits, origins, and methods are vast and fascinating. And this fascination we have with zombies has led us to speculate often how we would approach the apocalypse. What would we do in the event of a zombie uprising? How would it begin? Would we be prepared? Could we hold out? And these are all good questions, but being a student of medieval history, a different thought came to my mind. How would the medieval world endure a zombie outbreak? Could our ancestors withstand the rise of the dead? Would zombies overtake our more primitive ancestors? Today we're going to look at the primary factions of For Honor and discuss their historical counterparts. If zombies were to appear in their histories, in their countries, in their eras, their peak eras, what would happen? Today we're going to talk all about it. We'll be discussing what the factions would think of zombies as a concept. We'll talk about how they would respond to an outbreak for the first time, how they would adapt, how they would confront a full-on epidemic, and then what would they do in future should this ever happen again. We'll also discuss what advantages and disadvantages they have. Now before we start, let's lay the ground rules for this discussion. The zombies we'll be talking about are the classic Romero zombies. We're going to be talking about zombies who move relatively slowly, lack any intelligence, feeling, or memory from their previous lives, can be killed by destroying the brain, and will mindlessly pursue targets for the sole purpose of consuming flesh, spreading the virus, and turning others into a walking corpse like themselves. Now as for the factions, we're largely going to deal with these factions when they're at their peak. And also, we're dealing with these factions as they appear in real history, not as they appear in the For Honor game, okay? Now, with all that out of the way, let's get started. We shall begin with the Vikings. The Vikings have a major advantage right off the bat. They lack many large cities or central hubs. Now, while they do trade, their settlements, towns, and villages are largely sparse and spread out, making it harder for a zombie plague to spread easily. Should a town or village get infected, it would take time for the plague to reach other territories. Because think about like in movies or TV shows, where is it that the zombie plague would more easily spread? In large cities, where there are large numbers of people to bite and infect and spread the disease. Not so with the Vikings. They do not have that many super large metropolises or cities. Not only this, but many portions of Norse lands are separated by seas and rivers, meaning there are water barriers preventing zombie mobility. The Norse also had the advantage of arming themselves. In general, it was encouraged for the average citizen in a Norse town or village to be armed with an axe or sword for protection. And it becomes a lot harder for the zombies to feast on humans who are armed. Now, not only this, but Norse mythology already accounts for cases of undead events, which would be the Draugr. This understanding would give the Norse something of an advantage, as they would already feel like, okay, here's some dangerous undead thing, we know how to deal with this. However, they have their share of disadvantages too. For one thing, the climate of the Norse lands is rather temperate or on the chillier side, and that will allow the dead to slow their decomposition depending on the time of year that it happens. Plus, while the Vikings had armor like gambeson and chainmail, we don't know how many would have access to it, and mere tunics or cloth would be no defense against a zombie attack. Now, the Vikings were prized for their shields, which would come in handy, but it is easy to be overwhelmed by a horde. And plus, although it's true Vikings didn't have many large populated cities or hubs, this could turn into a problem too, because it may mean resources may not be stored in bulk in the event that the people are forced to hunker down in fortifications against the undead. If your city is naturally smaller, it will naturally have a smaller resource stockpile. Plus, the biggest threat of all is the very thing that made the Vikings famous: their sea trade and seafaring capabilities. The fact that the Vikings could move so quickly and effectively by sea and through trade routes increases the chance of the infection spreading to other lands. It's highly possible that the Vikings may inadvertently spread the plague farther than their own lands. Now, with all that said, how would the Vikings deal with zombies? Viking tactics against hordes will also be very risky, you gotta understand. Vikings are, at their core, raiders, specializing in fast shock and awe tactics. They charge a settlement, butcher those who resist, and then leave with the loot. If the Vikings don't know about the weaknesses of zombies, they might accidentally be making the mistake of rushing in and engaging zombies in close quarters combat without knowing to aim for head trauma. By the time they learn this, they might already be in too deep. I don't think the zombie plague would overtake the Vikings necessarily, but I do think they would have a struggle on their hands if they aren't careful. Now, on initial first contact, the Norse would probably assume the infected were merely madmen or overtaken by some curse, or, at worst, they would likely try to restrain or incapacitate the diseased, which would inadvertently lead to more infection, most likely. It's highly likely a whole village or town might be infected before the real danger can be assessed. Response to the new threat would be swift, though. Jarls and kings would begin sending soldiers to various villages near the ground zero and begin investigating for signs of infection or disease. Those healthy will be urged to evacuate, and those showing signs of disease would be incarcerated or killed, depending on the whim of the Jarl or king. Bodies would likely be burned to ward off any further contamination, and if the infection somehow got too out of hand, the response would likely come down to scorched land tactics, burning down the whole village and town to burn away the zombies, while refugees would be encouraged to move to safe zones. It is my opinion that the Vikings would, in the end, manage to overcome the zombie outbreak, if for no other reason than their ability to just pack up and leave infected land swiftly to find new ones if the need arose. In future interactions, if a village or town even got a whiff that zombies were rising, and the possibility emerging that a town could get infected, the town would likely be immediately abandoned and put to the torch, especially if more than one person was infected. Their response to the information about more undead would be swift and merciless, and all in all, the Vikings would certainly emerge all right from the experience, though a little worse for wear. Now, let's discuss the samurai. Specifically, let's talk about Edo Japan, the height of samurai power, because that is crucial as it leads to a very serious disadvantage that we're going to talk about soon. However, you may be surprised to know that the samurai have many advantages on their side when it comes to zombie outbreaks. The first is their terrain. Japan is an island nation, true, but there are various changes in elevation, climate, and terrain that can provide checkpoints, funneling points, and box-in positions to hold back hordes or to just escape them. Not only this, but the summer months of Japan are excruciatingly hot and humid, making decomposition quicker. The armor samurai warriors had at this time would be very impressive and far more effective at protecting against zombies, and the spears, naginatas, katanas, and kanabo would all be useful in self-defense. More than this, the use of rifles combined with palisades and the stellar samurai fortresses and castles would provide excellent defense from the hordes of the undead. But perhaps the most crucial advantage they have is their ruthless nature towards unclean things and disrespect. If a villager begins acting in a hostile way towards a samurai or poses a threat to the general public, samurai have no issues about cutting them down, and dead bodies rising up would be treated very quickly as an unclean threat. This overlook gives the samurai an immense advantage, their ability to just discard their empathy and just butcher those who they feel have wronged them or feel are a threat. That said, the samurai are not without disadvantages. For starters, while the samurai do have excellent armor, it's unlikely that they all would have access to a full set of expensive armor at the time of the outbreak. Those few that were forced to rely on simple silk robes or cloth with limited armor would not fare as well and be exposed to the zombie attack. Now, since samurai of this era were mostly without shields, there would be fewer buffers between them and the beasts. And while the samurai have exceptional weapons, the guns they have are single shot only. If they shoot that does not hit the head, it's wasted ammo, something that can't be afforded. But there is one major disadvantage, one that could put the entire nation in jeopardy. Assuming we're discussing the Edo period, and we're talking about the peak of all these factions, so the Edo period would be the peak of the samurai, then this is also the time of the weapons ban. Only samurai were allowed to own and carry weapons. Civilians were strictly forbidden. Now, obviously, when faced with a large enough outbreak, the shogun would likely temporarily repeal this for the sake of the people. But before that repeal, before it got to that, citizens would have almost no defense against the undead, meaning samurai strength would be the only thing protecting them. And that could be disastrous. Add on to the fact that there are several large cities at this point in Edo, Kyoto, and across the Kwanto, Japan is overflowing with potential outbreak hotspots locations, which would spread the plague exponentially. Plus, we need to factor in Eta villages. The Japanese had serious standards of cleanliness, and the social class of Japan who were considered the most unclean were the Burakumin, or Eta, and they were often forced to live in separate villages away from the higher ranked social classes. These were the ones who dealt with dead bodies, meat, and other dirty things. It's likely that these villages would be all but abandoned to their fates if a zombie outbreak broke out in their territory. The Japanese had various advantages and disadvantages in the face of an undead plague, as you can see. And unfortunately, I do feel like many of their disadvantages really hurt them. Now, first contact would likely go well for the Japanese. As I said before, the samurai had little issue killing those who behaved disrespectfully or hostilely. If reports came that a man or woman was acting savage or hostile, a samurai might be called in to deal with the issue, and if attacked, he wouldn't hesitate to cut down the attacker. Though he might be surprised when they don't die from an initial attack, then he might take the head off. This odd behavior would, of course, be reported, and if any further incidents turn up, there might be curfews put in place, doctors dispatched, and nightly watches. Rumors about yokai or angry spirits might circulate around among the people. Local daimyo would certainly try to be more rational about the situation than give in to mere superstition quickly. But should the infection get out of hand, or a full epidemic take place, then drastic measures would need to be taken. Some villages and towns would likely just be abandoned or burned. Civilians would be allowed to carry weapons again for personal defense, and armor would be distributed to as many samurai as were able. There would be strict body checks for any refugees to ensure that there were no infections, and fortresses and castles would turn into safe havens. Supplies would be conserved and rationed, and there may even be moments of the shogun abandoning whole provinces until such a time as they can send soldiers to liberate it. However, the topographical, geological, and technological advantages the samurai have would likely be enough to not only prevent such an event from occurring, but also be enough to turn the tide should it. And in the future, if another zombie appeared or was reported, we can expect the samurai to react swiftly and execute the infected, and possibly even all of the family members of the infected just to be safe. It's not unheard of. Give the samurai this: they are efficient. And the town that they are from would be investigated, and some might be forced to isolate until such a time as they can be assured that the issue is resolved. Any bitten or cut would be given immediate death and execution by decapitation. But in the end, I do see the samurai handling a zombie outbreak very well and efficiently. While they do have several disadvantages, those disadvantages only come into play if the outbreak gets out of hand. Their advantages are good on the short term. They're good at dealing with the outbreak once it starts. If it did get out of hand, then those disadvantages would come into play. But even then, I feel that the samurai would come out on top. Now let's move on to the knights. This is actually a bit more of a contentious topic for me, as when I read the book, The Zombie Survival Guide by Max Brooks, in which the author states that the knights would do poorly against zombies because of two reasons. One, that they're overly superstitious and would spend more time trying to pray the problem away than fix it, and two, their armor is too cumbersome and heavy to be used properly. Now, any scholar of medieval Europe could tell you the problems with these assertions, but we can forgive Max Brooks a little bit. He has something of a bias against the Christian church, so let's look at what would really go down. Let's start with the advantages. The fortresses and castles of medieval England and Europe as a whole, particularly by the time of the 14th and 15th century, are second to none. They are durable, large, spread out well. They would outlast most zombie horde attacks. And the church, while some might see as a hindrance, would actually be a blessing. You see, one of the big problems with a zombie outbreak is miscommunication or communications poorly received. Imagine if a zombie outbreak occurred today and news reports start going live about the horrors of undead people coming back to life. Mass panic would rush the streets. Mass panic would fill every city and town, and people would lose their minds. It might be worse than the zombie outbreak itself to see absolute anarchy fall apart and come about within these cities. But in medieval times, not everyone was literate, and this would be an advantage. Because Latin was the language of the educated, only clergymen and priests who were educated in the language could read reports or news about the zombie attack. This would help them disseminate the information provided and present it in a manner to avoid mass panic. The worst thing at this time would be for the entire public to read reports on undead monsters feeding on the living. The superstitious masses would indeed panic, but with educated men helping to decipher and disseminate the information, they can relay it in a collected and understandable way so that people are able to respond carefully and efficiently. Leave it to the intelligent to take this information and say, okay, how do I display this in a way that won't cause a panic? So that would definitely help in the end. Believe it or not, the church at this time was not that superstitious. Quite the opposite. They spent a lot of time trying to quell superstitions. Now let's add on to that knight armor, which was absolutely outstanding. A full-plated knight would have little trouble enduring a zombie attack, and even if only armed with gambeson, that's still an excellent protective covering to fall back on. Plus, the weapons of the knights would likely be the most effective of all the factions, considering polearms and halberds would be the best weapons I can think of for dealing with zombie hordes. They provide range, weight, bashing, and cutting potential. Combined with the tank-like properties of their armor, the knights would be unstoppable zombie-killing machines. However, despite these excellent advantages, there are a few disadvantages. While superstition may not be as big a deal as Max Brooks tries to claim, the Christian Europeans did have compassion. Familial ties and bonds of kinship were often strong thanks to the Christian doctrine of fellowship and loving thy neighbor. And since the Christian law says all lives are sacred, it would not be their first instinct to kill a sick man, and that may hold them back from acting when necessary. So if they see someone sick and they know they're infected, they may withhold killing them before they can become a problem. Plus, armor suitable for the knights was expensive, and a full set of plate armor could be hard to dole out where needed. Then there's also the issue that if all the serfs and peasants are sheltered in a fortress, that leaves no one working the land or tending the fields, which would cause issues later down the line in terms of supplies and productivity. It's hard to get more supplies into the castle when all of your farmers and serfs are in the castle. Now, when the first zombies are reported, it would likely lead to townsfolk and serfs panicking and trying to restrain or capture the zombie. This would lead to more than a few infections. If more and more people start falling to the plague, the Inquisition might have to be brought in to assess if this is a demonic possession situation. They would probably perform a few exorcisms, perform a careful analysis of the corpses and the behavior of the disease, and would eventually that would lead them to the conclusion that demons are not at work. Bear in mind that the Inquisition knew better than to assume that every hostile sick man was a demon host. They were trained and taught how to recognize the real thing. Even if they attempted an exorcism, recognizing that the demon did not come out would likely inform them that something else was afoot. Plus, seeing how the disease is spread by bites and cuts, they'd likely quickly come to a conclusion that this is some kind of pathogen or blood-borne thing of some kind. Immediately, a quarantine would be ordered, teams of armed men and knights would be sent into the villages, and those who were suspected of infection would be rounded up and inspected for bites or scratches. Those found with them would be restrained and placed in dungeons or cells likely to be studied and better understood. The others would be killed. Promptly. Information would be sent to the Pope immediately, who would have papal letters written up for all major cities and kingdoms in Christendom to inform them of what's happened and what to look for to prevent any further outbreak. The biggest hang-up for the medieval knights would be the fact that these monsters were once human. Like I said, the Christian church and Christian law is all about compassion. Love one another. All lives are sacred. So, since these creatures used to be human, would it be wrong to kill them? Could they be condemned for doing it? The papacy would have to acknowledge that while zombies were once human, they no longer have their souls, and thus are free to be cut down. You gotta take knights off their leash in this situation to make them effective. In the event that a full epidemic took place, serfs and peasants would be evacuated to fortresses and castles that could house them. Knights would be armed and dispatched to infected towns and villages to purge them. Killing the infected and burning the buildings and bodies would be their first modus operandi. Better to rebuild what's lost than to risk spreading the infection further. The physicians of the ancient world might begin working on a cure of some kind or antidote if possible, though that wouldn't be as large a priority as organizing supply lines and routes to towns and castles. Any kingdoms not as oppressed by zombies would be encouraged by the Pope to send relief and soldiers to struggling kingdoms and towns. It would be very similar to a crusade, where the church is able to unite various conflicting lands together for a common cause. With the assistance of artillery and burning tactics, the hordes would be more easily broken and dealt with. The knights aspect of the heavy knight armor means that they can afford to experiment by slashing and hacking at zombies repeatedly until they discover a weakness like the head, and the armor can defend them from bites or scratches. In the end, I'm almost certain a zombie outbreak would be swiftly and effectively put down. And in the future, the medieval world wouldn't allow such an event to happen ever again. They would be prepared. It's likely a knight order would be formed specifically to combat such outbreaks, like the Hospitallers or the Knights of Lazarus. I made that last one up admittedly, but wouldn't that be a cool name? If another outbreak should be reported, it would immediately be reported to the Inquisition, who would place the entire village or town under the authority of the papacy. Investigations would be launched, and citizens related to victims would be studied, locked up, and inspected for bites or cuts. Any who got bit or cut would be offered a merciful and quick death to be sent to God. In the eyes of the church, a zombie is nothing but a corpse whose soul has already been freed from its flesh, and is now nothing but a husk that can be killed. This will help to justify the knights' necessity to kill them, and in the end, the knights would probably be able to deal with the zombie apocalypse rather well. Now, let's talk about the Wulin. The issue here is going to be determining what era of Chinese history we should be looking at, because that will make a difference. For the purposes of this video, we'll be taking a look at the Tang Dynasty, considered by many to be one of the most powerful periods in China's history. China at this point in time would not only be incredibly prosperous, but its population size allowed it to dominate the Asian world. Its military began to adopt horse and cavalry tactics like their nomadic neighbors, and the infrastructure was far more secure than many dynasties that came before or that would come afterwards, allowing it to last for almost 3 centuries. So, should a zombie outbreak take place under the Tang, what would that look like? The truth is that the Chinese would have several advantages, such as their organized and very powerful military, their vast amount of territory and resources to draw from, very well built and structured fortresses and checkpoints, and relatively decent armor for the time period. We're talking 7th to 10th century. However, there are problems. Lots of them. For one thing, population size is a major issue. The population during the Tang Dynasty is estimated to be around 80 million persons, a relative buffet for the zombies. Plus, while the Tang military was exceptional, they weren't necessarily police. It would be harder for them to engage in the micro level. But perhaps China's biggest problem in dealing with zombies is their historical issues with political upheaval. The Imperial Court of China has infamously always had selfish and opportunistic parties intent on taking advantage of disaster for personal gain. I have no doubt that, if information reached the court of undead swarms harassing the populace, there would be those who censored the information, were not forthcoming, or perhaps used it to encourage their own rise to power or revolutionary action. The lack of unity would give time for the plague to get out of hand, and seeing as there is such a large population for people of China at the time of the Tang, and the fact that China has many large populous cities, a simple outbreak could turn into a nightmare very quickly. Of the 4 primary factions we've discussed thus far, the Wulin would be the ones who struggle the most. While I do see them as inevitably overcoming the threat, as China has often found clever ways to rally and solve difficult problems like this, I have no doubt that event would scar China for a long time. Cleaning up the infection might take years, and the instigation of warlords would likely be enforced to better maintain military presence around the country, which would be something similar to the collapse of the Han Dynasty in the beginning of the Three Kingdoms period. So, to put it bluntly, should the zombie outbreak take place and get out of hand, as I expect it would, the only way to quell it would be to implement basically a dynastic restructuring, not unlike the beginning of the Three Kingdoms period. Yeah, it would get that tough. Now, that about covers the 4 primary factions, but just for fun, let's briefly look at the 4 outlanders we have. For pirates, they'd likely do fine overall. As a non-uniform or official organization or nation, pirates are more than capable of escaping places of infection, and smarter ship captains will know to inspect their crew for potential traces of the infection among their crew and deal with it quickly. The biggest problem they're going to face is finding safe places to weigh anchor and resupply, as a village that's infected is going to be a bad place to end up. It's more than likely pirates would either decide to join a military effort to purge the threat, or simply find safer waters to live in. The Egyptians suffer from lack of substantial armor and hand-to-hand combat, but their use of chariots and archery would come in handy for hit-and-run tactics. The issue for them, though, is that archery will have limited success. In hand-to-hand combat, the lacking of heavy armor for the majority of the soldiers would be nothing short of disastrous. What's worse is that Egypt established itself along the Nile River, meaning they can't just pick up and leave if worse comes to worse. They're surrounded by desert. Without the Nile, the Egyptians are cut off from what they need to live. Eventually, I fear ancient Egypt would just shrivel under the weight of such an outbreak. They would undoubtedly need external assistance. Considering ancient Egypt did extend to the Middle Eastern territories, we might see Egypt relocate its capital away from Africa at some point, just to get away from the threat. The ancient Arabians would likely actually do just fine. Their fortresses are comparable to night fortifications, their armor, while not as good as full plate mail, is still sufficient enough for their needs, and their use of horseback warfare as well as strong hit-and-run tactics would serve them well in vicious engagements. The biggest problem they face is their religious doctrine and whether or not it would allow for the same compassion that holds back the Christian knights. Not only this, but Islamic faith is not as uniform at this point as Christianity was. There were various sultans and sects of Islam, and one might wonder if they would effectively unite to deal with this threat, or would they, like the Chinese, use this disaster as a means to prove one sect or sultanate is superior to the other and just go, "It's Allah's will that you're being destroyed by the undead. Allow us to help them defeat you." Only for the zombies to reveal, we don't discriminate against who we bite. However, when they realize that the zombies don't discriminate, that sentiment would likely falter, and then they'd unite again. So genuinely, I don't think they'd have too much of an issue. It might be a rocky start, but I think that the Ephyra and the Arabian Peninsula would do just fine. The Aztecs, meanwhile, would almost certainly be decimated. There are several factors that work against the Aztecs here. Firstly, lacking of heavy and encompassing armor. While some soldiers did have gambeson-style armor, it was not distributed to all the warriors. The hands-off nature of the empire means that they might not be swift in coming to the aid of their vassal states if they were overrun, and by the time they did launch a rescue operation, it may already be too late, and those soldiers would just be food for the undead. The jungle provides for useful camo for the Aztecs, but also for the zombies who would wander them constantly, making it dangerous to even venture alone into the jungle. But worse yet would be the spiritual reaction to zombies. As human sacrifice, cannibalism, and bloody rituals were things noted in the Aztec society, even if you don't want to call them common, they did happen. This would undoubtedly lead to several problems. If the Aztec religious believed that this disaster was caused by some anger from the gods, and there were attempts for sacrifices to fix it, this would cause problems. Killing massive amounts of citizens to appease the gods would do nothing more than take away more resources and dwindle your own population. Trying to sacrifice zombies or feed on them would only spread the plague wider. Imagine what kind of terror would erupt if news reached the Aztecs that during a ritual to sacrifice a zombie, not only did it keep moving after the heart was removed, but that zombie reached up and bit the priest. Panic would sweep the empire at that point. To be honest, and I don't mean this in a mean way, I question if the Aztecs could endure such a nightmare scenario. I don't want to be pessimistic, but it is a real question I have. In the end, I find it interesting to think about, but I feel that the majority of the factions in For Honor, considering their real-world counterparts, would have been able to endure and combat the zombie menace if it ever found a way into their history. I can't fully imagine how they would rewrite history as we know it today, but what I do think is so funny is that people are swift to call our ancestors backwards, savage, superstitious, and incapable. When you think about the ancient world and you think about the stereotypes that go along with them, we often like to denigrate them, make them sound lesser or worse. And yet, when you really understand them, their methodology and practical ways of thinking would likely have allowed them to fare even better against the zombie menace than we may give them credit for. In fact, I might even go so far as to say they would probably deal with the zombie menace overall even better than we would. An interesting thought to consider. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I had a great time making it, and I hope you enjoyed it. What did you think? Do you agree with my assessment? Do you disagree with my assessment? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, I will see you in my next video. Take care.